And hello, everyone, and welcome back to Black Mental Health Matters. Dr. Carryann Williams, I'm a psychiatrist practicing here in Massachusetts, and this is a talk show that's about everything related to mental wellness in the Black community. So if you want to call in, the phone number is 617-238-7111, and we're streaming live on Facebook. Facebook page is heat981fm.com. And today's show is dedicated to the history of Black mental health. So I want to talk about some people who have helped to pave the way for the study of Black psychology. These are some people who have defied the odds and done incredible things for our field. And we owe a lot of what we have today to the work that they have done. So let's just get right into it. The first person that I want to introduce you to is Dr. Mamie Phipps Clark and her husband, Dr. Kenneth Clark. Dr. Mamie Phipps Clark, she was born into the Jim Crow South in 1917 in Arkansas, and she earned a merit scholarship to Howard University. And at Howard is where she obtained her bachelor's and her master's degree. She was initially studying mathematics and physics, which of course were fields that were not particularly friendly to women at the time. And she wasn't really enjoying doing math and physics. And she met Kenneth Clark, who encouraged her to go into the field of psychology. She worked in an all-Black nursery school, and that inspired her master's thesis, which she entitled "The Development of Consciousness of Self in the Negro Preschool Children." And her partner, Dr. Kenneth Clark, was also a PhD psychologist. Together, they researched self-identification in Black children. And this turned into one of the most famously known experiments on internalized racism, the doll experiments, which exposed some of the effects of segregation on Black children. Have you guys heard of the doll experiment? It's a classic. So I've researched this on the internet, and there are a few differences in findings in how the experiment was set up. But in general, what the test involved was around 250 Black children, and a little bit more than half of them were children who attended segregated nursery schools in Arkansas. And a little bit less than half of them were Black children who attended integrated schools here in Massachusetts. And the ages of the kids were around age 3 to 7, all Black children. Okay. Now, all the children were shown 2 dolls. Again, in some places it says 4 dolls, but in most places it says 2 dolls. One of the dolls had white skin and yellow hair. The other doll had brown skin and black hair. And the dolls were basically identical in all characteristics except for color. That was the only thing that was different. One had white skin and yellow hair. The other one had brown skin and black hair. Each Black child was asked to identify the race of the doll based on the characteristics. And the psychologist would ask them, which one do you prefer to play with? They were also asked several other questions. One is they would ask them, which doll is the nice doll? And again, the child could point to the white doll or the black doll. The psychologist would ask, which doll is the bad doll? And that child could point to the white or the black doll. And then they would ask, which doll looks most like you? And again, they could point to the white or the black. And of course, the results were heartbreaking. More than half of the Black children had identified that the bad doll was the black one. Interestingly, about a third of the Black children, when asked the question, which doll looks more like you, pointed to the one that they had identified as a white doll. Okay, so this was a very influential psychological experiment. And it was used in the case of Brown versus the Board of Education to help to demonstrate the harmful effects of racial segregation in U.S. schools. And it was the first time that social science research was used in a Supreme Court case. So the U.S. Supreme Court was referring to the research done by the two Dr. Clarks, when they said this quote, "To separate Black children from others of similar age and qualifications solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone." So that's a powerful statement. Now, because Dr. Clark's husband, I guess Mr. Dr. Clark, he was the one that usually went to testify in court, and so a lot of times he gets credited with a lot of the work. But when he was interviewed, he would attribute credit to her as well. They both worked together, but she did a lot of the background work. Now, another major finding that the two Dr. Clarks found about Black children in their psychological research was that Black children became aware of their racial identity at around age 3. Around age 3 is they became aware of their racial identity. And along with becoming aware of their racial identity, they could also acquire a negative self-image around age 3. So this helped to lead some further research on self-esteem and self-concept. And their work was a major step towards the development of a new field of psychology that was known as developmental psychology. And the work of the two Dr. Clarks helps to influence the creation of a doll called the Sara Lee doll, which was the first mass-produced doll representing an African-American infant in 1951. So Dr. Mamie Phipps Clark and her husband, Dr. Kenneth Clark, they were the first Black Americans to earn their doctoral degrees from Columbia University, and that was in 1943. Her husband, Kenneth Clark, was also the first Black American to be president of the American Psychological Association. Dr. Mamie Phipps Clark worked as a research psychologist for the United States Armed Forces Institute. And while she worked as a testing psychologist at an organization for homeless Black girls, she noticed how limited mental health services were for minority children. So in 1946, Dr. Clark and her husband founded the North Side Center for Child Development, which was the first agency to offer psychological services to children and families living in the Harlem area of New York City. So the work of the two Dr. Clarks were useful during the Civil Rights Movement, where their expertise allowed them to testify as expert witnesses in several school desegregation cases, including Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. Dr. Mamie Phipps Clark passed away in 1983 from lung cancer at the age of 66. Now her husband, Dr. Kenneth Clark, lived to age 91, and he passed away in 2005. So that's Dr. Mamie Phipps Clark, the doll experiments, and the influence in the Brown v. Board of Education. The next Black change maker that I'm going to talk about is Dr. Inez Beverly Prosser. Dr. Inez Beverly Prosser. Dr. Prosser was the first Black female psychologist. Now, the year that she was born is not quite clear. We're not sure when she was born, but she was born into a family of 11 children at the end of the 19th century. And she lived in South Central Texas, and she went to a school that, at that time was designated as a colored school. And she then attended what's now known as Prairie View A&M University, which is a historically Black university located northwest of Houston. She obtained a 2-year certificate. She started teaching in Austin, Texas in 1913, first at a Black elementary school, then at a high school. And she finished her bachelor's degree at Samuel Houston College in Austin in 1926. Now, because of segregated schools, Dr. Prosser had to leave Texas to complete her graduate education. She completed her master's degree at the University of Colorado, and then she completed her doctorate in psychology at the University of Cincinnati in 1933. So Dr. Inez Beverly Prosser, her research, she looked at African American middle school children. Half of them were attending segregated schools, and half of them were attending integrated schools in the Cincinnati area. And her conclusion was that Black children had better outcomes in all Black schools with Black classmates and Black teachers. Dr. Prosser found that the Black children who went to the integrated schools had more difficulty adjusting socially and felt more insecure. They were more likely to feel inferior at school and to have less satisfactory relationships with their teachers and more eager to leave school early. And prominent African Americans such as W.E.B. Du Bois supported this view, feeling that the prejudiced attitudes of white teachers would create a negative experience for Black children. And so Dr. Prosser, so she got her PhD in 1933. Dr. Clark was 1943, about 10 years later. And so their research kind of showed slightly different things, right? Dr. Prosser is showing that Black children fared better in all Black schools with Black classmates, Black teachers, that it was helpful for their social development. And that makes sense, right? If you're in a negative racial environment, going into a school where you have a teacher that may be biased could create a negative experience for you. That does make sense. But with Dr. Clark's research 10 years later, her view is that the idea of legal segregation, the fact that the Black student cannot choose to go to the school where a white person is going to, that they're told they can't do that solely because of the color of their skin, that creates a feeling of inferiority. Because then it leads to the question, well, why? Why can't I go to those schools? What's wrong with me? Right? This idea that separate is not equal. So, Dr. Clark's research is this idea that, yes, well, Dr. Prosser found that with Black children surrounded by Black people, they do well socially, but the idea that now you can't interact with white people or go to white schools, that kind of gives you this idea that, well, there must be a reason. I'm not considered to be equal to them. I'm not as good as them. And it creates this feeling of inferiority. And that affects them developmentally as well. So I think it's been really interesting that we have, different Black psychologists that are trying to piece out these issues for the advancement of Black people in the country. So Dr. Ines Beverly Prosser, she got her PhD in 1933, but tragically a year later in 1934, she passed away right after she earned her PhD. While she was on her way to Mississippi visiting her family in Texas, she died in a car accident near Shreveport, Louisiana. So if you guys are just joining, you're listening to Black Mental Health Matters. I'm Dr. Kerryann Williams, and I'm a psychiatrist here in Massachusetts. And today it's all about Black history and leaders in Black mental health. And so I just spoke about Dr. Mamie Phipps Clark, who is a PhD psychologist who developed the groundbreaking doll experiment that helped to support the view that segregation in schools was detrimental to the social development of children and negatively impacts their self-identity and self-esteem. And I also spoke about Dr. Ines Beverly Prosser, who 10 years earlier had also done some research about the impact of schools, Black children in schools, and how that affects them. If you have a question or a comment today, you can give us a call at 617-238-7111. That's 617-238-7111. We're also streaming on Facebook on the page heat981fm.com. And you can drop a comment there as well. So the next person that I want to introduce you to is Dr. Frances Sumner. Dr. Frances Sumner was the first African American to earn a PhD in psychology. So I spoke about the first Black female psychologist. That was Dr. Ines Beverly Prosser. She was the first Black female psychologist, but the first African American psychologist was Dr. Frances Sumner. And Dr. Sumner was born in Arkansas in 1895. He's known as the father of Black psychology. He did not have a formal high school education, but he was able to pass an entrance exam to Lincoln University, where he graduated magna cum laude with honors. And he later on enrolled at Clark University to pursue a bachelor's in English in 1916. After that, he returned to Lincoln University as a grad student, and he got approved to be a PhD candidate, but he was not able to begin his doctoral dissertation because he was drafted into the Army in World War I. And then once he returned from that service, he enrolled in the doctoral program at Clark University. And he became a professor and went on to publish several articles. Now, as understandably, many research agencies refused to provide funding for him because of his skin color. But Dr. Sumner was interested in understanding racial bias and supporting educational justice, basically race psychology. He was one of the founders of the psychology department at Howard University. And he played a significant role in the education of other Black psychologists, including Dr. Kenneth Clark, who I mentioned earlier was a husband of Dr. Mamie Phipps Clark. Dr. Kenneth Clark was one of the people that Dr. Sumner had a hand in supporting and educating, in addition to other Black psychologists in the past. Dr. Francis Sumner was the chair of the psychology department at Howard from 1928 until 1954, when he passed away from a heart attack. So that's Dr. Francis Sumner, a lot of greats. Now I want to talk a little bit about a psychiatrist, actually the only psychiatrist that I'm really going to talk about today. And that is Dr. Solomon Carter Fuller. Dr. Solomon Carter Fuller. He was born in 1872 and died in 1953. So he was born in 1872 in Liberia, in Monrovia, Liberia. But his paternal grandfather was originally from Virginia. He was a slave. His paternal grandfather was a slave in Virginia who had purchased his freedom. He bought his freedom, actually bought his and his wife's freedom, and then moved to Liberia after purchasing their freedom from slavery. And so his paternal grandfather was originally a slave. His maternal grandparents were both medical missionaries in Liberia. And so the thought is that maybe their work influenced his original interest in medicine. So Dr. Solomon Carter Fuller, he immigrated to the United States from Liberia at age 17 and completed a 2-year internship at Westboro State Hospital here in Massachusetts. And after this internship, he was appointed as the hospital pathologist and instructor of pathology at Boston University in 1899. Dr. Solomon Carter Fuller, he was one of 5 research assistants selected by Alois Alzheimer. Yes, the same person after which Alzheimer's disease is named. He was one of 5 research assistants selected by Alois Alzheimer to work in his laboratory at the Royal Psychiatric Hospital in Munich. Dr. Fuller was the first to translate much of the Alzheimer's research into English, and he published the first comprehensive review of Alzheimer's disease. In that review, he reported the 9th case of Alzheimer's ever described. So he was a trailblazer in the field of psychiatry, but interestingly, they never really taught me about him when I was in medical school, Dr. Fuller was an associate professor of both pathology and neurology at Boston University in 1921. He was the only African American on the faculty at that time, and as one might expect, he was paid less than his fellow white professors. And when he acted in the role of the chair of the neurology department, they never formally gave him the title. So he was basically the chair, but they didn't give him the title. And he finally retired in 1933 at the age of 61, when a junior white assistant professor was promoted to full professorship and appointed the official department chair. So Fuller was quoted as saying, "With the sort of work that I have done, I might have gone farther and reached a higher plane if it had not been for the color of my skin." So Dr. Solomon Carter Fuller has been credited with helping to uncover one of the leading theories in the cause of Alzheimer's disease, which is called amyloid plaques. Amyloid plaques is one of the leading theories for the cause of Alzheimer's disease, and Dr. Fuller was a part of that, a part of uncovering that. He also played an instrumental role in researching other psychiatric diseases, but due to racism, he did not receive the credit, the titles, or the compensation that he deserved at that time. So the next person I'm going to talk to you about is somebody who's still living. She's probably the only one in the group here that's still alive, but her name is Beverly Daniel Tatum. And in a second, I'm going to play a clip, but let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Tatum. Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum is a clinical psychologist, and she's the author of a book called "Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria?" and Other Conversations About Race. And this is a book that I read, and I was drawn to the book title because it was one of the questions that I had when I first immigrated to the US, was this question of kind of why are all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? Because coming from Jamaica, I didn't necessarily see that kind of like grouping together. People tended to just intermingle. When I came to the US, I noticed that they tended to be groups of people that had racial things in common tended to sit together and kind of self-select to sit together. And I was very curious about the kind of what was behind that. And the book that she wrote, "Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria?" it answered that question and so much more. It's just one of many of her works focusing on racism and its effects on the American school system. And she supports the view that racism, especially in schools, can have a detrimental effect on students' racial identity formation, and that we need to continue these conversations on race. She was born in 1954, and she earned her bachelor's degree in psychology from Wesleyan University, and she earned her PhD in psychology from the University of Michigan. She also has a master's in religious studies from Hartford Seminary. And in 2002, she became the 9th president of Spelman College, and she was there for about 13 years. So 13 years later, in 2015, she retired from that post. And a year before, she had earned an award from the American Psychological Association for outstanding lifetime contribution to psychology. And so I wanted to play a video clip of her. It's about 13 minutes long, but it's worth the listen. The title of it is My Skin Brown Because I Drank Chocolate Milk? And it's basically a conversation that she had with her 3-year-old, where she talks about race and about slavery. And so for those of you that are wondering, how do you talk to small children about these issues? This is a great clip to listen to. So Marv, would you mind playing the clip of Beverly Daniel Tatum? All right, so thank you so much. Yeah, you know, I really enjoy this particular clip from Dr. Beverly Tatum, because I like how she breaks down the conversation about race, how to talk to a small child about race and about slavery, because at that age, at around age 3, age 4, that's when kids start to become more race conscious and are in danger of kind of absorbing those negative views about themselves and about what does race mean. So if you guys are just joining, you're listening to Black Mental Health Matters. I'm Dr. Kerryann Williams. I'm a psychiatrist practicing here in Massachusetts. And today I'm talking about Black mental health history. I talked about the first Black psychiatrist, the first Black psychologist, the first Black female psychologist. And so if you want to call in with any comments or questions, the phone number here is 617-238-7111. That's 617-238-7111. We're also streaming live on Facebook, on the Facebook page, heat981fm.com. And you guys just heard, and if you're watching the live stream, you would have also seen the video clip of Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, who is a leading psychologist in our country currently, and she just has a way of entering into these conversations about race in such a relatable way. You know, she wrote a book called Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And then this particular clip was titled, Is My Skin Brown Because I Drank Chocolate Milk? And it was a conversation she had with her three-year-old, and then later when her son was 4, she had a conversation again with him about race and about how to talk about slavery with children without frightening them, but also in a way that describes us not just as passive victims of slavery, but also as folks who fought against it and continue to fight against it. So she does some really great work. The next trailblazer that I want to talk about today is Dr. Robert Lee Williams II. Dr. Robert Lee Williams II, he's a little bit of a character. He's a leading figure in American psychology, and he is known for studying cultural biases present in standard testing measures, especially the IQ test. The Robert Lee Williams was born in 1930 in Little Rock, Arkansas, so another psychologist coming out of Arkansas. When he was 16 years old, he attended Dunbar Junior College for a year, then dropped out, discouraged by his low score on an IQ test. He later enrolled at Philander Smith College, graduating cum laude in 1953. Then he got a master's degree in educational psychology in 1955. And that year, he was hired by the Arkansas State Hospital as a staff psychologist. And while he was there, his supervisor encouraged him to pursue a doctoral degree. So he went to Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, and studied clinical psychology, earning his PhD in 1961. Now, following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in April 1968, Dr. Robert Lee Williams helped to organize the Association of Black Psychologists, and he served as the second president of that association from 1969 to 1970. Now, 2 years later, Dr. Robert Lee Williams created the Black Intelligence Test of Cultural Homogeneity. The Black Intelligence Test of Cultural Homogeneity, which abbreviates to BITCH. Yes, his test was called the Bitch 100. And it was a 100-question intelligence test that was specifically oriented towards Black experiences and language and culture. And basically, his work helped to shatter the notion that Black people had lower average intelligence than white people. Right? It showed that the differences in the IQ scores were likely a result of speech differences and differences in experience that skewed the IQ tests in favor of white people, right? So when white Americans took his Black intelligence test, they scored lower than Black Americans because his test was skewed towards Black culture, just like he was trying to say that the standard IQ measures were skewed towards white culture, right? So his work added to this larger body of work showing that standardized IQ tests have racial and cultural biases that can result in lower scores for Black students. And so his test, the Bitch 100, picked up what's called intellectual indicators not commonly found on conventional tests. And according to his published research article I had read through this week, he said 3 of the most prestigious individual ability tests systematically excluded Black children from the normative samples at the time. Because, you know, in order to create an IQ test, you need to have a standard group that's considered the normal intelligence group. And then some people, of course, will score higher than normal intelligence, some lower than normal intelligence. But this group was usually standardized based on white middle class children. So anybody that didn't fit into the category of white middle class, this test was not actually very generalizable because it didn't really include people from diverse backgrounds. It was skewed towards using the language used in white homes and the cultural references and vocabulary used in white homes. So I watched a brief interview with him where he spoke about how in his intelligence test, he changed some of the vocabulary. So for example, in this IQ test, a psychologist might ask someone, name the object behind the sofa. And you say, well, the Black child might be a little bit confused because in their home, they don't call it a sofa, they call it a couch. And they may not say behind the couch, they may say in back of the couch, based on how they may have spoken at that time. And so he would change his test to reflect the language and the vocabulary of the children to show that they were just as smart as white children, but they were confused by the language used in the test. So guys, if you're wondering where the term Ebonics comes from, look no further than Dr. Robert Lee Williams. He coined the term Ebonics. It's a combination of the word ebony and phonics. Ebony, phonics, Ebonics, okay? And this was a term to describe the way that African Americans spoke English. And he explained that some of the features can be traced back to various African languages. However, some linguists dispute that particular claim about it being able to be traced back to African languages. Some people say they can't. Trained linguists say that that's not necessarily true. But in any case, Dr. Robert Lee Williams published a volume called Ebonics, The True Language of Black Folks. And in 1980, he wrote a second book, The Collective Black Mind, Toward an Afrocentric Theory of Black Personality. And in 2007, he published a book, Racism Learned at an Early Age Through Racial Scripting. 2011, he was inducted into the Arkansas Black Hall of Fame. And he actually passed away just last year, August 2020, at age 90. So you guys should check him out. He has some interviews and different things where he talks about Ebonics and he talks about Black intelligence and just the idea of how these normative samples come about, and the fact that if it's based on a white group, that's your standard, it's not really generalizable. The intelligence testing is not very generalizable. So it needs to bear in mind cultural differences and language differences, and not get confused with those things when you're trying to determine someone's intelligence. Okay. So I want to talk about Dr. Joseph White. Dr. Joseph White has been called the godfather of Black psychology. Dr. Joseph White helps to found the Association of Black Psychologists. He was born in Lincoln, Nebraska in 1932. Dr. White completed his PhD in clinical psychology at Michigan State University. I think this is another person that went through Michigan State, where he said that he was the first Black graduate student in clinical psychology. And when he earned his PhD in 1962, he said that he was only one of 5 African Americans in the nation with a doctorate in clinical psychology. 1 in 5 African Americans in the nation with a doctorate in clinical psychology in 1962. Yet, when he tried to find someone who would rent him a home near Cal State Long Beach, he had great difficulty finding someone to rent to him. That was just the state of the country. So Dr. Joseph White supported the development of Black psychology, arguing that applying white psychology to Black people often unfairly created the illusion of Black inferiority, when it was actually a reflection of culturally irrelevant psychological principles being applied to Black people, right? So he argued that psychology as developed by white psychologists have less applicability to Black individuals. Because again, you think about it, right? White psychologists living in white neighborhoods and surrounded by white culture, they're going to interpret and come up with psychological theories that completely exclude the experience of people that have a different cultural experience and different background. So their work is not always generalizable. And so he wanted to highlight that. But also Dr. White argued that white psychologists are prone to unfairly labeling African Americans as deviant or diseased. This is something that continues to come up, is that sometimes certain diagnoses are disproportionately kind of imposed upon Black individuals, you know, if one does not understand the cultural differences. So the Dr. Joseph White his writings are widely considered to have contributed to the creation of ethnic studies programs and what we now call cross-cultural psychology. His work helped to contribute to the development of cross-cultural psychology, this idea that psychology needs to be understood in the context of the person's culture, right? In 1984, he wrote a book called The Psychology of Blacks, and he challenged the idea of Eurocentric psychology being considered as a norm and the standard against which every group should be measured, right? Because that's just how it's been for a long time. This idea, of course, of white supremacy, right? That white people are the standard and the norm against which all other people should be measured. A lot of our leading figures in Black psychology have tried to work very hard to shatter this idea of, you know, who's the norm here? What's the standard against which all of us are being measured? This standard needs to be looked at, right? So Dr. Joseph White passed away in 2017. Now, to close out the show, I just wanted to say a few things about Black mental health history. Oh, I think there's a comment on Facebook that says, not to correct, but University of Michigan versus Michigan State University. Oh, okay. So I think one of the earlier psychologists was University of Michigan, and this other one was Michigan State University. So, and I may have said that they went to both to the same place. So thank you for pointing that out, that they're kind of different universities. Thank you. Okay, so I wanted to say a few things about Black mental health history. So in addition to the individuals who sought to be trailblazers in the field, it is worth mentioning the way that mental illness in Black people was seen just in and of itself, right? So I found this article written by Dr. Uchenna Ume, and it was written in March of 2019. And Dr. Ume writes that in 1848, there was a physician named John Galt, who was the medical director of what was at that time called the Eastern Lunatic Asylum in Williamsburg, Virginia. And Dr. Galt said, Blacks are immune to mental illness. Dr. Galt believed that enslaved Africans could not develop mental illness because, as enslaved people, they did not own property, engage in commerce, or participate in civic affairs such as voting or holding office. So this idea of mental illness at the time, he thought, well, it can only affect people who are exposed to the stress of profit making, basically, white people or white men. And so Dr. Ume writes, mental illness has been in existence as long as humans have inhabited the earth. But for people of African descent, little or no references are available about mental illness before the 1700s. Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was a leading medical authority in the nation during the years immediately following the American Revolution, he was the most prominent medical practitioner to disagree with Dr. Galt's ideas about Blacks being immune to mental health problems. He felt like Blacks did suffer from mental illness, but like a lot of practitioners of the day, he still got it wrong, right? So he did say that, they can suffer from mental illness, but his description of the illnesses were maybe a little bit off, okay? So he did write that some of the enslaved suffered from abnormal behaviors and something that he called negritude, which he described as an irrational desire by Blacks to become white. And so he actually opposed interracial relations because he felt like having a mixed race child kind of promoted negritude, this idea that Black people want to become white. So these wrong ideas. And he also wrote that the Africans become insane soon after they enter upon the toils of perpetual slavery in the West Indies. So again, there's kind of this thing that there's an acknowledgement that slavery creates problems, but not really a full understanding of what's going on. Other medical researchers at the time coined terms like drapetomania, which is a disease that caused enslaved Blacks to flee their plantations. So trying to escape slavery was considered pathology. And another one, I may butcher the pronunciation, but dysesthesia Ethiopia, which is a disease that would cause a state of dullness and lethargy, maybe what we would call depression at this point. Well, these are expected trauma responses to the trauma of slavery, but it was pathologized by white people, you know. And there's a physician named Dr. Samuel Cartwright who supported slavery, and he recommended severe whipping as a treatment for those issues of running away or becoming depressed. And so Dr. Ume says in her article, these physicians just didn't get this connection between the emotional states of the enslaved and the treatments that were recommended. So there's kind of this long history of people getting it wrong. And this is why it's so important that we had Black psychologists, and we do continue to have Black psychologists that are fighting to kind of get things right, for people to kind of understand us. And of course, a lot of this is rooted in the historical idea that Blacks were not equal to whites, right? So if you are going into this thinking that Blacks are not as human as whites, that they don't have the same complex emotions, then when you start to see them showing their humanity, it's going to be confusing, right? If you see Black people as beasts of burden, that they're incapable of having complex emotions and of less intelligence and less value, then you're going to be confused when you start to see them show their humanity. And you pathologize it and punish them for them showing their own humanity. And to this day, we're still fighting, unfortunately, to show the larger community that some of the things that you see in Black patients are not innate to their Blackness, but they're circumstantial, right? Generational trauma, suppression of wealth building, disproportionate imprisonment, mass introduction of addictive substances into their vulnerable neighborhoods, poverty, internalized racism, right? We are still, to this day, fighting against the belief that Black people are somehow innately less capable or less motivated. So we have come a far way, but there's still a way to go. So I would just, encourage you guys to continue to, promote the right messages, continue to educate yourselves and your colleagues. And it doesn't mean that you can't see, a white provider if you need medical attention, because we have come a long way and people are more informed now, but definitely support those, who promote representation in medicine and in psychology. I hope you guys really enjoyed the discussion today. I really enjoy talking with you guys about these things. If you have any questions or comments throughout the week, just drop me a note on Instagram and Facebook at drkerryann. That's drkerryann. Join me again next week for Black Mental Health Matters every Sunday at 1 p.m. on 98.1 FM, The Urban Heat. So I will talk with you again next week.